Nothing in this world will last forever. Except Sonic 06 loading screens. Games are very complex pieces of software with tons of assets that can fill up entire hard drives. It takes time for computers and game consoles to access all of the data stored within these games. So, as a result, there are times when the player will just have to sit there and look at a loading screen. What I find really interesting about loading screens is that, a lot like fashion, they went in and out and back in style over the years. In the early 80s, computers like the Commodore 64 used cassette tapes, which I'm pretty sure most of you guys watching have probably never even seen before. These things stored data on pieces of magnetic tape. These things were pretty cool, but it takes the better part of a century to read information off of them. You could probably read the entirety of One Piece before some of these games would load. However, as we made our way to the mid-80s, we saw the explosion of the dedicated home video game console. Home consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Master System, and the Atari 7800 use read-only memory cartridges. What makes cartridges really great is that these cartridges, to oversimplify things, basically become a part of the console when their connector pins are plugged into it, meaning data can be accessed insanely fast, which is why if you go back and play an old game on an old console, you'll notice that despite the fact that these old consoles have less processing power than the average toaster these days, they have next to no load times at all. Cartridges were the main form of storage for game consoles for almost a decade until the release of the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in 1994. These consoles used compact discs instead of game cartridges, which Nintendo would infamously continue to use with their game console of this generation, the Nintendo 64. The benefit of using CDs over game cartridges at the time was that comparatively, CDs were cheaper and held way more data than cartridges. The downside, though, was that the data inside of CDs was a lot slower to access than cartridges. Consoles like the PlayStation have optical disc drives that use a laser beam that reflects off of the disc to read the game's data. Like with cassettes, it takes time to read through the necessary data for a particular part of a game, although not nearly as long as with cassettes. Optical storage became the main way that home consoles ran games for many years, and we still use them today, but in the last decade or so, we've seen the explosion of digital downloading. Now, game consoles still need a place to actually put the data that they get from online, and for that, they typically use some sort of storage drive, whether that be the magnetic hard disk drives or, in recent years, the much faster electronic solid state drives. SSDs are like Sonic the Hedgehog after one too many Red Bulls. These things are insanely quick, which is causing loading screens to be shorter and shorter. But they are still around, and they have been for many years. So, now that we've looked at the history of loading in games, let's take a look at some loading screens. A lot of loading screens are pretty simple. You might get a piece of generic looking artwork with some text that a sweaty intern made in 2 minutes, or maybe a spinning icon. Or if the game devs really want to go the extra mile, they might even give you a progress bar so you'll know exactly how much time you have to do your laundry. Most game devs didn't spend too much time making their loading screens look pretty because, why waste time on a loading screen when you can be working on the actual game? But at the same time, back when load times could take a while, it was sensible to make loading screens somewhat interesting, as the player would be staring at it for at least a dozen or so seconds, and with some games you might get the dreaded multiple load times before you even start playing the game, so hey, there's no harm in making waiting a bit less boring. One of the ways game devs made loading screens less boring is by including lore. The original LEGO Star Wars games didn't have voice acting, they told their stories primarily through expressions and miming, so they used their loading screens to tell the backstory behind each level in the signature Star Wars text scroll style. Final Fantasy XV gives little snippets about different characters and locations in the game's world. Final Fantasy stories can get a little complicated, and there's a number of different characters, so having a couple of brief reminders on the loading screens is pretty cool. Kingdom Hearts 3's loading screens are these little posts from some sort of in-universe Instagram knockoff. It definitely is silly, but admittedly, it is fun seeing what the characters post. Although you do have to wonder how the heck some of these pictures were even taken. The Witcher 3 gives you a recap of the game's story, which is something I think every RPG should have. I can't tell you how many times I've taken a break from a big story-heavy game and completely forgotten everything that's happened. Meaning, I'll either have to look up a story summary online while dodging spoilers like I've got Ultra Instinct, watch a playthrough, or just suck it up and try to remember everything as I play. Some loading screens include tips on how to play the game, which we've seen in games like GTA 5, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. No one wants to sit through a bajillion tutorials for things you can probably learn on your own if you play for a while anyway, so using the loading screens as a way to give the player useful but not necessary information is pretty smart. While game devs have come up with several different ways to make loading screens more interesting to look at, some developers took a different approach and instead they opted to make the loading screens less noticeable. This is usually done with a cool animation to hide the loading times. Probably the most famous example is the original Resident Evil games. You get an animation for things like opening up doors, climbing ladders, and taking elevators, which gives the game time to load a new area. In Sonic CD, while the game loads a new time period for each level, it shows this animation of Sonic moving through time. RPGs are well known for their flashy battle transitions that serve as a great time waster to load in the battle arena and enemies. Persona 5 has cool transitions with pedestrians walking in and out of frame, and Insomniac's 2018 Spider-Man game has Spider-Man riding the subway, with the occasional drunk guy using his shoulder as a pillow. Some games went all out and included full-on mini-games in their loading screens. Now, we haven't seen a lot of this, and a big reason why is because Namco actually filed a patent in the 90s for auxiliary games that could be played while the main game was loading. This probably dissuaded other developers from using loading screen minigames, as it would mean they could end up in legal trouble, or they might have had to pay Namco to use loading screen minigames. Namco and subsequently Bandai Namco after the merger did occasionally use loading screen minigames in some of their games, like how they made their classic shoot 'em up Galaxian the loading screen of Ridge Racer on the PS1. They also had a lot of loading screen minigames in the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games. In Tenkaichi 2, you can use the analog stick to aim Yamcha's Spirit Ball to hit these targets. And in Tenkaichi 3, there are 3 different loading screen minigames, but they are all basically just mashing the face buttons to do something faster. Some developers managed to find a loophole in the Namco patent, like Platinum Games with Bayonetta, which basically had a practice mode for its loading screen. Technically, this wasn't an auxiliary game or a minigame of sorts, it was the main game, just a way to practice combos. In 2015, the Namco patent finally ran out, but there really weren't a lot of games after that that used loading screen minigames. It's weird, you'd think you'd have waves of games experimenting with new and unique loading screen minigames, but nope. Though there is a pretty good reason why. There was simply no need for loading screen minigames. Thanks to how advanced technology has gotten and how fast SSDs are, games can load incredibly fast now. Maybe not as fast as the old games on the NES and Sega Genesis, but still very quick. This is obviously a great thing, not having to wait for a long time for a game to just start is fantastic. However, there are some people out there who do miss loading screens. Maybe it's having a brief chance to rest, or maybe it's a chance to prepare yourself mentally for the upcoming challenge, or maybe it's just Stockholm Syndrome, but enough people must have felt this way because some game devs have even included fake loading screens. This is a bit of an older example, but the Resident Evil remake could load multiple rooms without the need for the door animations, but Capcom kept them in anyway. In the remastered version of the 2018 Spider-Man game, the game can load after fast traveling within a few seconds, but you have the option to turn on the old subway animations that were in the original version of the game that played for the dozen or so seconds that the game took to load, just in case you really missed those drunk guys. To me, this is the best way to do things. I don't have a problem with fake loading screens as long as there's a way to turn them on and off. I feel like loading screens will probably always be a thing, specifically because online games exist, and with the Burger King Wi-Fi that you know at least one person in the lobby is always going to have, there'll always be loading screens while everyone connects. I would like to see more loading screen minigames in the future. In any case, it'll be interesting to witness where loading screens will go next.